In this week's In-Ear Insights, let's talk about buy or build. Now, this is a topic that has come up many, many times over the years, from the earliest days of whether you should even run your own email server versus using a commercial service, through marketing technologies, open source products, for example, like Matomo and Mautic, versus commercial properties like HubSpot, and even to in artificial intelligence, which is where there's a lot of discussion happening today with open source models like the Llama family and the Mosaic family versus commercial services like ChatGPT. So the question is, should you buy or should you build? So Katie, in your looking at this from a governance perspective, a corporate responsibility perspective, and a, hey, that thing vanished that I was paying for perspective, what's your take on buy versus build?
Well, unsurprisingly, there's a lot of dependencies. And one of those dependencies is your overall business strategy. Where do you want to be with your business, in a month, 6 months, 2 years, 5 years? And so that will start to educate everyone on whether or not you should build your own thing and own it, or if it's just a small part of moving the business forward and it's okay to buy it. The second piece is, do you have the skills in-house, or do you have to build out that skill set first to maintain this thing? And so on and so forth. It almost kind of sounds like we're talking through the 5 Ps. What is the purpose? Who are the people? What is the process? What platform? And then how do you measure performance? It's almost crazy how, you can always tie it back to the 5 Ps. So the first question is, what is the purpose of this thing? And not what is the purpose, like what does it do? But what does it do for the business? How does it move the business forward? How does it serve the customers? How does it fit into the workflow? How does it help our team members do their jobs? And so understanding all of those questions. So that's where I would start with trying to understand build or buy. I think of it the same way that I think about projects around my house. There's certain projects that I am completely capable of doing myself. And then the other 99% of the projects I need to outsource to a contractor because I either don't have the tools. Like, for example, I was putting a cart together yesterday for my garden, and I didn't have the correct tool. So I ended up using an adjustable plumber's wrench because it was the best proxy of a tool that I needed to tighten the bolts on the cart. It was the wrong tool. It got the thing done, but it wasn't done properly. And so I think when you're thinking about build or buy, do you have the tools? Do you have the skills? And so there's a lot of questions to ask before opening the wallet. What do you think, Chris?
Well, I was going to ask you, where do you put regulatory requirements in this?
I put that honestly in all 5 Ps.
Okay.
So let's say you work in a regulated space like pharmaceuticals, for example, and you have to, store your data a certain way, and you have to report on your data a certain way to federal governments. That needs to be part of your purpose. That needs to be part of your user story. So, as the person who is up all night, every night, thinking about the, protection of our data, I want to bring on a piece of software so that I can maybe sleep at night and not worry about data breaches. That's a pretty strong user story, and there may not be software out there to do exactly the thing that you need, so you would have to build it. The challenge, especially in regulated industries, is there's a general set of rules that applies to everybody, and then when you get into each organization, the rules are unique depending on the workflows and the customers. And so in those instances, a lot of times it's quote unquote easier to build your own thing to conform to the rules and regulations that you have versus buying a piece of third-party software that you then have to adapt to your rules.
Right. I was specifically thinking in this case of Google Analytics, right? We know that for compliance with the EU's GDPR rules, Google Analytics, even the new version, Google Analytics 4, is not fully compliant. There's some things that are still not permitted and that it still does. And apparently Google's kind of going, go ahead, try to sue us. But if you're a company, within the EU, for example, you probably want to use a piece of software like Matomo, which if you host it on your own servers, which is now you're into the build territory, you can be fully compliant with EU law, which as an EU business you would want to have to do. When we look at what's happening with things like large language models, we're starting to see a patchwork of regulatory differences. So the EU is saying you may not use scraped data in your models to build these models. That's a violation of copyright. Japan went the other way and said scraping data for AI construction is not a violation of copyright and it's fully permissible there and things. So there's then there's a question of, do we buy? Because if we're buying from a company that does its model construction hosting in Japan, we're compliant with that law, or do we build knowing that we have to comply with certain laws? So there's a bunch of regulatory sort of constraints on a lot of these technologies. In terms of, go ahead.
I was going to say, but that's what I was saying is, you have to understand what your needs are first to see if there's software that already does the thing or needs to be only slightly adapted, or if there's generic software that you then have to highly customize. And so it depends on what you need. And so, both cases are fine, but you have to also think about the long term.
And the long term is something that really got me thinking about this past weekend about I was actually thinking about stuff on Netflix, believe it or not, and all the different streaming services and Spotify and stuff like that. When you pay for these services, you don't own anything, right? If you stop paying for Spotify or whatever, all that stuff just vanishes into the ether. Whereas in the old days, like when we were young and rebellious, you would go out and buy a CD and you own this CD. You have this piece of plastic for as long as it lasted, and even if you chose never to do business with that company again, you still have a CD that you could put in your music player and listen to that music. Today with like streaming services, you can't. And so much of our marketing technology is that same thing, right? Where if you say you don't want to do business with, say, Salesforce anymore, the moment you terminate your account, everything is gone. Right? You have nothing left. Whereas if you build, like if you're using, say, oh gosh, what's that one? Sugar CRM, the open source product. If you build that thing and that is running on your servers, that is yours. Even if you never do business with Sugar again, you have the system, the server, the data and stuff, and all that is something that never goes away as long as you maintain that piece of hardware.
But I guess that goes back to the question of your need. Do you need all of that data if you decide to part ways with your CRM provider? Or, do you want to hire a team to maintain that information that maybe you only look at once a year? And so there's no right or wrong answer in this conversation. It really comes down to the specific needs of each individual company and team. So, in that example of Salesforce, maybe what you do is you export all of your data or make copies of the information that's in there and then put it into a different one. And then it doesn't matter, what the outside shell of the CRM looks like. You have the data regardless. I mean, there's different ways to look at the same problem. And so you really need to go through that exercise of understanding what you need short and long term before deciding to build or buy. So, we've talked about building our own CRM and our own processes. And for us at this time, it's a nice to have. We're still a relatively small company in terms of the number of contacts that we have. And so using a system that we buy or rent rather is good enough. At some point, we may get large enough that we want to build our own, but at this time, we're not there yet. And so maybe that's the solution for a lot of companies, is that they sort of rent to own, like you do a piece of property, or you rent until you can afford to build your own.
Mm-hmm. I think the other consideration, and one that we talk about a lot with things like artificial intelligence, is if it's an ancillary system or service, like it helps you do your job better, that's probably fine to rent. If it's a part of your secret sauce as a company, you probably should own it, because otherwise you are you are fully dependent on another company for a core functionality. It's one of the ways that you make money. And if you lose access to that vendor, if they go out of business, or they quadruple their prices, you're kind of stuck with them.
So let me push back on what you just said. So one of our core sets of services has to do with Google Analytics data. We're not about to go out and build our own comparable Google Analytics system, even though we are reliant on the data that comes out of that system. And when Google made their announcement to sunset Universal Analytics and bring on Google Analytics 4, we had to rewrite and rethink all of our services because we're dependent on Google Analytics data for our core services. But at no point in the history of our business have we had a conversation or even inkling of, should we build our own Google Analytics-like system because we are dependent on the data for our services to be successful?
That's not entirely true.
It is entirely. We've never had that conversation.
We have we've not talked about building our own. We have talked about, and we are in the process of doing for one of our clients actually, is building some of our core services for Adobe Analytics. And as we covered on the live stream a few weeks ago, which if you missed the episode, you can find it over at trustinsights.ai/YouTube, is building a system that allows you to extract data out of the Matomo system, because if you're going to back up your Universal Analytics data, you would have that data stored in that system as well. So we've never talked about building our own analytics software because that's just crazy. But we certainly talked about having alternatives to the 800-pound gorilla in the room.
Right, but without the analytics systems, our services don't work.
True.
And so that goes back to the build or buy. We, regardless of the analytics system, we're always going to have to, quote unquote, buy, because we are not in a position to build our own because, for a variety of reasons. Number one being market penetration. We will never get the same market penetration of a Google or an Adobe or even a Matomo with those analytics systems. Therefore, we will forever have to buy.
Right. And a bigger consideration on that front is, I don't know what we could offer that would be better than the existing market alternatives.
You think that's a bigger consideration than all the work that it would take to actually build the thing?
I do, because I think if there was such a compelling value proposition, such a blind spot in the market that we thought was really important, we would build it in the same way. Like, for example, we built our multi-touch attribution system because we saw a gap in the way Google Analytics does it. And we couldn't find anything else in the market that even came close to what we thought made sense. So like, okay, we're going to build this sucker.
Right, but we're still reliant on the data that comes out of Google in order for that to work.
Correct. But I'm saying even in the case of like digital analytics, if there was a glaring gap that we're like, hey, we could make $1 billion on this, yeah, we'd give it a shot.
Can you think of any examples of any companies that have 100% built all of their own stuff and are not buying or renting things from any other third parties?
Not currently. The student loan network that I worked at, a number of years ago, actually did that, and it was a very painful experience. Like, we hand wrote our own CRM because we couldn't find anything on the market that we wanted. We operated our own mail servers. We operated our own web servers. We rented, obviously, the hardware to do that on, but we hand built all that stuff. It was miserable.
But did you also then use systems like Microsoft Office or payroll systems that were third-party systems?
We used an open source alternative for like the first 6 years of the company because the company couldn't afford the licensing, and we were not willing to steal it. So we used open source alternatives. Yeah, it was like I said, it was not fun.
So it sounds like, but there's still some level of buying or renting other services.
Yes, there certainly is some other entities. We were more self-contained, than say the average company. But yeah, I mean, no company can do everything from scratch. There's no way to do that in the modern world.
And I think that that is where you as a company need to start making those decisions. So Microsoft Office, for example, is one of those things. Like, sure, you can build your own using something like Open Office, or you can use, Google Docs or Google Sheets. But either way, you're still reliant on a third party to create a Word document, whatever the system may be. And so we as consumers, we as business people, we as professionals, we're okay with that because that's not a system we're ever going to build ourselves. But yet when we start to think about large learning models, we're like, oh no, we have to build our own. And so obviously we're talking about two different kinds of things. But I guess my question, from a psychology standpoint is why is one okay and we're not okay with the other?
I don't know that it's not okay. I think it's like you said, it comes back to the requirements gathering. Like, what is going to be essential that you cannot lose access to? Otherwise, it's sort of game over. And if you are building a large language model of some kind, and it is core to your product, like that is what you do, I feel like the risk of binding yourself to a vendor that may or may not be here in 6 months, a year, 2 years. If you're staking your whole business on that thing, that to me seems like a risk. It's one of the things when I see on LinkedIn every week, here's the 200 new AI companies that have come out. Like, well, 198 of these will not be here in 6 months because they're one-trick ponies built on someone else's architecture. And once they start to scale, they're going to realize, hey, this is going to get real expensive real fast, and we're not making enough money fast enough to cover the costs.
How long, I mean, this is going to be a wild guess, but how long before you think these AI companies and large learning models become essential tools in the MarTech stack? So for example, like when people say, what are the essential tools that I need to start a business? We always talk about things like, well, you probably need, accounting software, and you need, some sort of document repository, and you need, a basic CRM and an email server. How long before large learning models and generative AI tools are essential, not, nice to have, but like essential?
Large language model skills will be a must-have by the end of this year. Mm-hmm. And here's why. Not because you're going to be building or buying your own model, but because it's going to be in everything. Microsoft Office with Copilot will be out probably in the next 3 months, where you'll have an LLM prompt right inside of Office saying, hey, convert this press release to a PowerPoint, right? So being able to work with prompts like that. You already see it with Google's search generative results, the SGE stuff that is now, Google has said, we're going to sunset this at the end of the year because this is going into mainstream Google search. So generated search results, which like wow. You're going to see it in Windows 11 before the end of the year. So your very operating system is going to have a language prompt to be able to ask things in. We already have it in HubSpot's chat spot, and I have no doubt that Dharmesh is going to take that out of alpha and move it into the product sooner rather than later. We have it in Adobe Photoshop, the new generative fill. So if you are working in Photoshop, there it is. You have it in Adobe Firefly. The new version of Adobe Express just rolled out with generative AI built into it. So from the buy or build section, in this particular skill set case, it's a moot point because the technology, the core technology, is going to be in every piece of software that you can imagine. Now, should you build your own would depend on the use case. But what we're seeing with a lot of the new open source models is because they're open source, they're commercially licensable, and they're much lower power and cost. Those are going to be in everything. You already see it. It's already in Snapchat, for example. You can talk to your AI friend, which is a really weird experience, by the way.
Unsurprisingly, I don't use Snapchat, so that just sounds odd.
Yeah, it's going to be in TikTok. The thing that's going to be very interesting is in customer service applications. So this is one where I think there's going to be a lot of application where you'll have a language model that powers a chatbot on your website that is more intelligently trained to realistically answer customers' questions better than the existing chatbot technology, which really still kind of sucks.
Marketing profs release that. So, they tend to be more educational. They have courses, they have a lot of content. So I would imagine that if I was sort of imagining how this all played out, they were like, hey, we have all this information. Why don't we basically turn it into an interactive FAQs, which is essentially what they did with their content, which was, on their part, a really smart move.
Exactly. And so that goes back to, buy or build. In their case, we won't disclose anything confidential, but they saw an opportunity with their data. Like, yeah, and that is a big consideration in buy or build, is if you're going to build something, even if you're going to be using other, foundational architecture, you've got to have the data to be able to do that. And you've got to be able to have the data be clean and ready to go. So you've got, a huge amount of requirements gathering to see, could we do this? I've been testing something and it's not ready for prime time in the slightest because it's still really wonky. But we have our own data stores of information that we could use to tune a model. I've actually been trying to train it on the data from our Slack group. If you go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, I can export the conversations as a server administrator from there, de-identify them, remove all the personal data and stuff like that, but then take the conversations themselves, because we talk a lot about stuff like analytics all the time, unsurprisingly. And if I can get one of the open source models and tune it based on the conversations we have in Slack, we might get a model that is better at answering analytics questions than, say, the off-the-shelf model.
Provided the information is correct.
Provided the information is correct. Likewise, it could export our own internal Slack data and tune that, and tune a model on that as well, so that we could continue our quest to make an AI agent version of you, so that you can just sit on your deck all day long.
Dare to dream.
Exactly. But so that's an example where, because that would be something that eventually would be core to us, it makes more sense to build. Now, we're not building the foundational model, but we are building the fine tuning to make something that we would eventually own and operate. Also, we're doing that with open source models because it's a lot lower cost. And if it blows up and doesn't work at all, it was just my time on the evenings and weekends to mess around with this thing, and not $100,000 worth of compute time over at OpenAI.
So it sounds like, obviously there's a lot of considerations if you want to build or buy, but one of the things you really need to be clear about is, do you have enough of the raw material to build the thing first? What is your long-term plan for the business? How does it fit into the overall strategy? Do you have the skill sets in-house, or do you also have to buy those, because that's not inexpensive? Do you have a process established to build this thing, maintain this thing, understand this thing? What tools, what platforms do you need? Because, if you're buying it, it tends to be, not always, it tends to be self-contained and you have all the things you need. If you're building it, you tend to need multiple platforms to build one cohesive thing. And then how do you measure whether or not you were successful? Did you build the thing? Did it save time? Does it, move the company strategy forward? Does it do anything useful for your customers? And that all goes back to understanding your purpose.
Does it even work?
Well, yeah. That's
yes, but there's a lot of things where maybe it doesn't work and stuff. Where there's a lot of products that never get to MVP.
So I know, Chris, you are, strongly in the build my own camp. But what products, what services, what software are you comfortable buying and not building?
Anything that's not essential, right? Anything that is not going to be part of the secret sauce, to me, is something that I feel perfectly comfortable buying, right? Email systems, Right? That is not a core competency of our company. I'm more than happy to let Google do all the infrastructure maintenance for that, because that is just a pain. Running a web server, no thanks. WP Engine, here's my money. Take my money, because I don't want to do that. I've done it. It sucks. And there's very little, there's no extra added value for me running an Apache 2 server versus somebody else running it and doing all that stuff. There's just no value add there. Like you mentioned earlier, Office software, no thanks. There's no extra value to add there. The stuff that there is value add are things like our multi-touch attribution, our marketing mix modeling. Those are things that, yes, there are vendors out there that do that. They are way more expensive than we can afford. And their quality, from what I've seen and what I've talked to, their quality isn't any better than what we can do ourselves. And I'll obviously put a big asterisk on that based on what you were saying earlier, Katie, which is you've got to have the people with the technical skills to do this stuff. It's not something everyone can do.
Mm-hmm. And I think that is, we could sort of go down the rabbit hole of talking about it, but that is one of the more overlooked pieces of this whole conversation. Because we've been talking a lot about the softwares and technologies, but, as a company is saying, well, AI is the thing, and I want to introduce AI, well, guess what? You need to have people who actually know how to build and operate and maintain the thing. And that may not currently exist as a skill set on your team. And so you then have to go out and hire contractors or full-time employees or vendors and consultants to do the thing and figure out even where it fits into your company. And that is not an inexpensive endeavor.
And it can be very risky. One of the very fortunate things about Trust Insights is that the technical skills that, and the stuff that we do also live in one of the co-founders. So it's not like I'm just going to, quit and leave tomorrow. But that exact scenario happened at our previous company, where I had all of the technical knowledge to maintain the systems. And then when we left to found Trust Insights, within a month, all their stuff stopped working because it wasn't constantly being maintained.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the institutional knowledge. I mean, that's true of anything for any company. That's a risk, regardless. If I suddenly decided to walk away tomorrow, despite you having all of the technical skill sets, the company itself would cease to stop moving forward, because there's a lot of things that I do that I know about the company, Chris, that it's just not in your best interest at this time to focus on. And so, whether you leave or whether I leave, the company would come to a screeching halt. Really.
So that's a strong argument for a buy strategy, or I guess, I like what you said earlier. I really am thinking about rephrasing it as rent versus own, because I think that's the more clear thing. But the rent strategy makes a lot more sense in cases is where you have retention problems. Right. Where maybe your company isn't the best place to work. And so if you can't hold on to people for more than 18 months, rent is a lot safer of a bet, because the vendor will probably outlast you.
And, if you think about it, like, sometimes renting is just a temporary solution versus, if you think about it in terms of buying, like that feels like a long-term investment. But if you think about it, it's just a slight mental shift in terms of renting. That can get you over the hurdles to sort of like, okay, it might be a little expensive now to rent, but while we're renting, we're training our team, we're building out the skill set so that we can then, decide, okay, we're done renting, we're ready to buy the thing, we're ready to own it ourselves.
Right. Or you find out this ain't going to work.
And that's another, great way to approach it is if you rent first, it's a lower, I wouldn't say lower risk. It's a different set of risks in terms of trying to figure out if you even want to do this thing, if it even makes sense for your business. And then you're not fully invested in building and owning the thing yourself. You're like, you know what? This didn't work out. Let me go find a different property to go rent and see if that one suits me better.
Exactly. If you've got some stories that you want to share about rent versus own, buy versus build, and you want to share them, pop on over to our free Slack group, which we rent from Slack. Go to trustinsights.ai/analytics for marketers, where you and over 3,200 other marketers are asking and answering each other's questions every single day. And wherever it is that you're listening to the show, if there's a platform you'd rather have it on, go to trustinsights.ai/TI podcast, where you can find the platform of your choice and subscribe. And while you're there, please leave a rating and a review on wherever it is you're enjoying the show. It does help to share the show. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll talk to you next time.